The school called. Your daughter has not been picked up and it has been 5 hours. I gripped my phone standing in the middle of my accounting firm. I said, I do not have a daughter. I am 35 and single. The administrator let out a harsh sigh. She said, just come get her, or we are calling the cops on you for child neglect. Confused and angry, I drove there. I walked into the office and saw a little girl sitting in a leather chair. She had my exact nose and my exact complexion. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your life turned upside down by a family secret you never saw coming. The phone ringing on my mahogany desk had shattered the quiet focus of my office just 30 minutes prior. I was deep in a multi-million-dollar corporate audit, my specialty as a forensic accountant, when I answered that unfamiliar number. The crisp, irritated voice on the other end had not even bothered with a greeting before launching into accusations of child abandonment. When I told her she had the wrong person, she patronized me, insisting they had my emergency contact information on file. My blood ran cold at the threat of police involvement. I grabbed my coat, marched out of my firm, and drove straight to the address she gave me. The elite Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy was a fortress of privilege. The walls were lined with portraits of wealthy donors and legacy families. I stood in the center of the plush reception area, my designer heels sinking into the thick carpet, staring at a 6-year-old girl I had never seen before in my life. Her name tag read, Aaliyah. She was clutching a worn teddy bear, swinging her feet nervously. The physical resemblance was so uncanny, it stole the breath right out of my lungs. Looking at her was like looking at a photograph of myself from 30 years ago. A tall, stern woman with a tight bun marched out of a back office. She introduced herself as Principal Hastings. She did not offer her hand. Instead, she crossed her arms and glared at me with absolute disdain. She said, "It is completely unacceptable to abandon a child at our facility, Miss Washington. We have a strict policy. If a parent is more than 2 hours late, we contact Child Protective Services. I have already drafted the incident report." My shock quickly morphed into a cold professional anger, the kind of anger I use when I catch a corrupt CEO hiding offshore accounts. I stepped right up to her desk. I said, "I suggest you shred that report immediately. This is a case of mistaken identity. I have never been pregnant. I have never given birth. I do not know who this child is, but she is absolutely not mine." Principal Hastings let out a dry, mocking laugh. She reached into a manila folder and slammed a piece of paper onto the polished wood of her desk. She said, "We require comprehensive documentation for all our enrolled students. Do not stand in my office and lie to me." I looked down at the document. The world around me seemed to stop spinning. It was a certified state birth certificate. The name of the child was Aaliyah. The mother listed was Zuri Washington. I stared at the text in absolute horror. It had my full legal name. It had my exact date of birth. It listed my social security number. It even listed an old billing address from an apartment I rented right out of college. At the bottom of the page, supposedly validating the entire document, was my signature. My eyes locked onto that signature. As a forensic accountant, I spent my days verifying documents, tracking financial footprints, and spotting corporate fraud. I knew my own signature better than anyone. The name written on that line was mine, but the handwriting was not. The loops on the letters were too perfectly rounded. The slant was too deliberate. It was a masterful forgery crafted by someone who knew me intimately. Someone who had access to my most private, secure information. Someone in my own family. Aaliyah let out a soft whimper from the leather chair. I turned to look at her. A single tear rolled down her cheek, leaving a wet trail on her face. She looked so small, so incredibly abandoned. She whispered, asking if nobody wanted her anymore. My heart shattered into a million pieces. The principal picked up the office phone. She said, "I do not have time for whatever family drama this is. I am calling Child Protective Services right now. They can take custody of the girl and sort out your lies later." I looked at the phone, then back at Aaliyah. If Child Protective Services walked through those doors, this little girl would be thrown into a notoriously broken foster care system. She would be handed over to strangers, processed like a piece of lost luggage, and scarred for the rest of her life. The system would not care that she looked exactly like me. They would only see an unwanted child. A fierce, undeniable protective rage ignited deep inside my chest. Whoever had done this to her, whoever had stolen my identity to abandon a child, was going to pay. But right now, my only priority was keeping Aaliyah safe. I placed my hand firmly over the receiver of the principal's phone, pressing it down to disconnect the line. I looked Principal Hastings dead in the eye. I said, "Do not dial that number. I will take her." The principal raised an eyebrow, a triumphant smirk appearing on her face. She said, "I thought you said she was not yours." I grabbed a pen from her desk. I said, "I am taking her home. Hand me the release forms." She slid a clipboard across the desk, muttering about irresponsible parents. I signed my actual signature on the dismissal sheet, the stark difference between my real handwriting and the forged birth certificate glaring up at me. I turned my back on the principal and walked over to the leather chair. I knelt down so I was eye level with Aaliyah. I offered her a soft, reassuring smile, trying to mask the storm of fury brewing in my mind. I told her we were going to go to my house and everything was going to be okay. She hesitated for a second, then slid off the chair and took my hand. Her tiny fingers wrapped tightly around mine. We walked out of the school together, leaving the judgmental stares of the staff behind us. I helped her into the back seat of my car, securing her seatbelt before getting behind the wheel. As I drove us toward my downtown penthouse, the reality of the situation fully settled in. Someone had stolen my identity to birth and hide a child. Someone had let this little girl believe she was unloved. And I was going to use every single resource I had to destroy them. The drive to my downtown penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. Aaliyah sat in the back seat, her tiny hands gripping the seatbelt strap, staring out the window at the passing city skyline. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. It was like looking at a ghost from my own childhood. She had my high cheekbones, my deep brown complexion, and the exact same arch to her eyebrows. I brought her up the private elevator to my floor, stepping into a space that was entirely unequipped for a 6-year-old. My apartment was a testament to my career, featuring sleek white marble, sharp modern lines, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. It was the sanctuary of a single highly successful woman who lived for her spreadsheets and corporate audits. I guided Aaliyah to the velvet sofa in the living room. I turned on the television to a cartoon channel, handed her a bowl of fresh strawberries I found in the fridge, and told her I would be right back. She nodded silently, pulling her worn teddy bear tight against her chest. Her resilience was heartbreaking, but I could not afford to break down. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. I walked into my home office and shut the glass door. I placed the photocopy of the birth certificate that I had demanded from Principal Hastings onto my desk. I turned on my high-intensity task lamp, bathing the document in harsh white light. I am a forensic accountant. I spend 80 hours a week hunting phantoms in corporate balance sheets, tracing hidden offshore accounts, and dismantling multi-million-dollar shell companies constructed by ruthless executives. Analyzing a forged signature was child's play. I leaned in close, examining the ink strokes that formed the name Zuri Washington. The handwriting was not a random imitation by some faceless identity thief. It was deeply, intimately familiar. The capital Z had a dramatic, sweeping flourish. The W was perfectly rounded with a distinct rightward slant that defied standard cursive rules. I stared at those loops, a cold dread washing over me. I had seen that exact signature on 100 different documents growing up. I had seen it on pageant entry forms, sorority rush applications, and custom stationery. It belonged to my older sister, Kendra. Kendra was the flawless, untouched jewel of the Washington family. She was the former Miss Black State University, the pride and joy of our parents, and the walking embodiment of their elite social image. As the realization took hold, the pieces of a 6-year-old puzzle began snapping together with sickening precision. 6 years ago, I was 29 years old and completely isolated from the family. I had been stationed in London leading a grueling audit for a massive international merger. I was sleeping under my desk at a Big Four accounting firm, running on black coffee and ambition, determined to build my own empire, far away from my parents and their suffocating expectations. The time difference and my punishing workload meant I rarely spoke to my family. I missed Thanksgiving that year. I missed Christmas. I was too busy proving my worth to pay attention to family gossip back in the States. Meanwhile, Kendra had been on the verge of launching a highly publicized public relations career in Atlanta. But suddenly, my mother Vivica announced to the entire church congregation that Kendra had been selected for an exclusive year-long cultural immersion program in Paris. It was presented as a prestigious opportunity. They posted heavily filtered photos on social media of Kendra sitting at French cafes. But now that I thought about it, every single picture was cropped tightly from the chest up. She was always wrapped in oversized designer coats or seated behind large tables. It made absolute terrifying sense. The golden child of Reverend Calvin Washington had gotten pregnant out of wedlock. A scandal of that magnitude would have humiliated my mother in her elite social circles and completely derailed my father's bid for the National Synod presidency. They could not risk the gossip, so they shipped her away to hide the pregnancy. But when it came time to deliver the baby, Kendra needed an identity for the hospital paperwork. She could not use her own name without leaving a permanent searchable public record that could ruin her future marriage prospects with the wealthy political circles my parents desperately wanted her to marry into. She needed a clean, untarnished identity belonging to someone who was out of the country and entirely distracted. She used mine. She stole my social security number, forged my signature, and tied me legally to a child I never knew existed. I pushed the birth certificate away, my hands shaking with a mixture of absolute disgust and mounting fury. I stepped out of my office and walked back into the living room. Aaliyah had pushed the bowl of strawberries aside. The television was still playing colorful animations, but she was not watching. She was pulling at the hem of her uniform skirt, her small shoulders trembling. I knelt down on the rug beside her, keeping my voice as soft and steady as possible. I asked her who usually picks her up from school. She wiped a tear from her cheek and said, "Miss Brenda usually comes, but Miss Brenda packed her bags this morning. She said she was not getting paid anymore and told me to just wait at the office." Then Aaliyah looked at me with those eyes that mirrored my own, and she asked a question that shattered whatever was left of my restraint. She asked why Auntie Kendra left her there. She said Auntie Kendra promised to come today because it was a special day, but she never came. The title Auntie Kendra echoed in the pristine silence of my living room. The cruelty of their arrangement was suddenly crystal clear. Kendra had birthed this little girl, pawned her off on a discreet paid caretaker named Miss Brenda, and simply played the role of the fun aunt who dropped by with gifts. She got to maintain her pristine socialite image while shifting the legal and moral burden onto a fake identity. But today, the money to the nanny had dried up, or the secret had become too heavy to maintain, and they had just abandoned her at a school, knowing the administration would trace the emergency contacts back to the name on the birth certificate. Back to me. My sadness completely evaporated. What replaced it was something lethal, calculating, and entirely destructive. I was no longer the quiet, compliant younger sister who let her family dictate her worth. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had left a terrified 6-year-old girl sitting in an office fully prepared to let her be swallowed by the foster care system just to protect their precious reputation. I pulled Aaliyah into a gentle hug, wrapping my arms around her small frame. I promised her that nobody was going to leave her ever again, and I meant it. I stood up and grabbed my phone. I made a quick, urgent call to my most trusted friend to come over immediately and sit with Aaliyah, ensuring she had a safe, comforting presence while I stepped out. I walked to my closet and pulled out my sharpest tailored blazer. I knew exactly where my family was tonight. They were holding court at the exclusive alumni and church board mixer at the country club, smiling, networking, and acting as if they were the pillars of the community. They thought I was just a boring numbers cruncher who would quietly absorb their mess to avoid a scandal. They were about to find out exactly what kind of monster they had created. I gathered the forged birth certificate, slid it into my designer bag, and headed for the door. The Heritage Country Club was a fortress of Southern aristocracy and old money. Tonight, it hosted the annual Alumni and Church Board Mixer, an exclusive gathering where reputations were currency and appearances were everything. I handed my keys to the valet and strode through the double mahogany doors. I did not bother checking my coat. I was not staying long. The grand ballroom hummed with the clinking of crystal glasses and the smooth sound of a live jazz quartet. I scanned the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. It took me less than a minute to find them. They were holding court near the center ice sculpture, the absolute picture of perfection. My father, Reverend Calvin Washington, stood tall in his custom suit, laughing heartily at a joke. Beside him was my mother Vivica, draped in emerald silk, her smile practiced and flawless. And there was Kendra. She clung to the arm of her husband, Trent. Trent was a wealthy white legacy trust fund kid, currently mounting an aggressive campaign for city council. He was shaking hands, kissing babies, and playing the political savior to the local community. Kendra looked like the perfect demure political wife, nodding and smiling right on cue. I did not slow my pace. I marched straight through the crowd, ignoring the confused glances of church elders and fraternity brothers who recognized me. I reached their table just as Trent was wrapping up a story about his commitment to family values. I reached into my designer bag, pulled out the photocopy of the forged birth certificate, and slammed it flat onto the center of their table. The heavy slap of paper against wood echoed sharply over the jazz music. The conversation around them died instantly. Kendra looked down at the document. All the color drained from her face. Her perfect pageant smile vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. Trent glanced at it, confusion wrinkling his forehead. My father stiffened, his jaw clenching, while my mother's eyes darted frantically to the surrounding guests to see who had noticed. I looked directly at my sister. I said, "You forgot to pick up your daughter from school today, Kendra." The administration was about to call Child Protective Services. Trent frowned and looked at his wife, asking what I was talking about. Before Kendra could even open her mouth to stutter an excuse, Vivica sprang into action. She let out a loud, artificial laugh that grated against my ears. She grabbed my arm with a grip like a vice. She told Trent that I had been working too hard at my accounting firm and was clearly exhausted making up nonsense. She said she would take me to get some fresh air. I yanked my arm away, but Vivica stepped into my personal space, her back blocking the view of the other guests. She clamped her hand onto my wrist again, her manicured nails digging into my skin, and dragged me forcefully toward the private alcove near the restrooms. Calvin followed closely behind, his heavy footsteps thudding against the marble floor. Once we were out of earshot from the ballroom, the polite facade completely shattered. Vivica pushed me against the wall, her voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper. She demanded to know what was wrong with me barging into a high-profile networking event like a madwoman. I shoved her hand away. I said, "What is wrong with me is that I just found out my sister stole my identity 6 years ago to hide a pregnancy, abandoned the child at a private academy, and left me as the emergency contact to take the fall." My mother did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She smoothed her emerald silk dress and glared at me. She said, "Lower your voice right now, Zuri. Do you have any idea what is at stake here? Trent is launching his city council campaign next week. His family comes from generational wealth and ruthless political pedigree. If they find out Kendra had an undocumented black child out of wedlock before they met, it will completely destroy his pristine image. They will cut him off, and his campaign will be over." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling absolutely sick to my stomach. I asked her if that was supposed to justify identity theft. I asked her how she could let a little girl believe she was unloved just to protect a white politician's campaign optics. Vivica rolled her eyes. She said, "You are 35, single, and obsessed with your spreadsheets anyway. You have the money and the space. Just take the girl and raise her. Do it for the family legacy. It is a small sacrifice to make sure your sister secures her future." A small sacrifice. They had stolen my name, saddled me with legal responsibility for a human life, and were now demanding I raise the child in secret to protect their social climbing. The sheer audacity was staggering. I looked at my mother and laughed a cold, humorless sound. I told her she was out of her mind if she thought I was going to be the scapegoat for her golden child's mistakes. I said I am leaving here, and I am driving straight to the police station. I am filing a full report for identity theft and fraud. That was when my father finally spoke. He stepped out of the shadows of the alcove, his towering frame imposing. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down at me with a chilling, arrogant smirk. He said I would not do that if I were you, Zuri. I crossed my arms and challenged him, asking why I should not report a felony. Calvin stepped closer, his voice dropping to a smooth, commanding baritone that he usually reserved for his Sunday sermons. He said because your sister did not pull this off alone. The hospital required notarized documentation to finalize the birth certificate and bypass certain identity checks. As an ordained minister and a certified state notary, I processed the paperwork myself. I stamped it. I signed off on the verification. The air left my lungs. My own father, the revered community leader, the moral compass of his congregation, had actively participated in stealing my identity. He had used his state authority to legally bind me to a child I did not bear. Calvin smiled a cruel, victorious expression. He said, if you go to the police, you do not just expose your sister. You expose me. You will be sending your own father, a respected reverend, to federal prison for document fraud. You will destroy this entire family in one night. So go ahead, Zuri. Make the call. Let us see if you really have the nerve to tear down your own blood. He thought it was a checkmate. He thought leveraging his own freedom would force me to back down and submit just like I always did when I was younger. He thought I would prioritize the family name over my own life. Vivica gave me a smug, dismissive look, adjusted her necklace and linked her arm through my father's. They turned their backs on me and walked confidently back into the ballroom to resume their performance for the elite. I stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, my blood boiling with a new dangerous kind of clarity. I could not go to the police. The legal fallout would be a messy public circus that could put Aaliyah in the crossfire. But my parents had severely miscalculated. They thought the police were the only weapon I had. They forgot what I did for a living. I am a forensic accountant. I do not need handcuffs to destroy a man. I just need his ledgers. The police would have put them in a cell, but I was going to take everything they valued. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number of my fraternity brother DeAndre. The war had just begun. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown accounting firm, but I felt nothing but ice-cold clarity. I had barely slept. Aaliyah was safe back at my penthouse eating pancakes under the watchful eye of my sorority sister Camille, who had dropped everything to come stay with her. I had arrived at the office an hour before my staff, locking myself in to prepare. I knew my family would not let last night go. I knew the retaliation was coming. I just did not expect it to walk through my front doors before I even finished my first cup of coffee. The heavy glass doors of my suite swung open with a violent thud. I did not even flinch as loud, heavy footsteps marched past the reception area. My door flew open, and there stood Trent. He was wearing a meticulously tailored navy suit with his shiny new city council campaign pin secured to the lapel. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, but his face was flushed with an ugly, blotchy red. He looked exactly like what he was, a wealthy, entitled legacy kid who was used to throwing tantrums until the world bent to his will. He stepped into my office and slammed the door shut behind him, the glass rattling in its frame. He did not ask to sit. He marched right up to my desk, planted his hands flat on the polished wood, and leaned over, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. I remained seated. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, maintaining absolute eye contact. He asked me if I had lost my mind. He kept his voice low, but it was practically vibrating with rage. He said, bursting into the country club like a lunatic, threatening my campaign, threatening my wife. Do you have any idea the kind of damage control I had to do last night to keep the church board from gossiping? I set my coffee mug down. I told him his campaign was the least of my concerns. I reminded him that his wife committed felony identity theft and abandoned a 6-year-old girl at a school. I asked him if his campaign manager had a PR spin for child abandonment. Trent stood up straight, letting out a sharp, condescending breath. He buttoned his suit jacket, suddenly switching tactics. The aggressive politician vanished, and the arrogant white savior persona took over. He paced a short circle in front of my desk, shaking his head with a patronizing smile. He told me I was being overly emotional. He said Kendra made a mistake when she was young and scared. She was protecting her future. She knew you had a stable job and a quiet life. She knew you could handle it. We are actually doing this kid a favor. A life with you is better than whatever group home she would have ended up in. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air, a toxic cloud of privilege and delusion. They had stolen my identity, pawned off a child, and he was standing in my office demanding I view it as a charitable act. Trent reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and a gold fountain pen. He flipped the book open right on top of my quarterly financial reports and began writing. The scratching of the pen was the only sound in the room. He tore the check out and slid it across the desk toward me. He told me to look at the numbers. He said there is $50,000 on that piece of paper. Consider it retroactive child support. Consider it a down payment on her college fund. Buy her a nice wardrobe, put her in a decent private school, and keep her out of sight. You get a family without going through the trouble of finding a husband, and Kendra gets to move on with her life. Everybody wins. Just keep the bastard kid quiet, Zuri. Keep your mouth shut, stay away from the press, and never show your face at our events again. I looked down at the check. $50,000. To a man like Trent, born into generational wealth, money was a magic eraser. He genuinely believed he could write a check and wipe away a felony. He believed he could buy my silence and purchase my complicity. He looked at me with a smug, expectant grin, waiting for me to snatch it up like a grateful subordinate. I picked up the check. I held it by the edges, studying the crisp watermark and Trent's jagged signature. I looked back up at him. I asked him if he honestly thought $50,000 was the going rate for a stolen identity and an abandoned child. Trent rolled his eyes, his patience snapping. He said, "Do not push your luck, Zuri. You are a glorified bookkeeper. You sit in this office and crunch numbers for local businesses all day. 50 grand is probably a third of your annual salary. Take the money and play the supportive aunt, or I will make sure you walk away with absolutely nothing." I did not break eye contact. I placed my thumbs on the top edge of the check. With one slow, deliberate motion, I tore the $50,000 bribe straight down the middle. Trent flinched as the sound of ripping paper echoed in the room. His smug smile completely vanished. I placed the two torn halves on the desk right over his gold campaign pin reflection. Then I picked them up, stacked them, and tore them again. I tossed the shredded pieces into the metal wastebasket beside my desk. I told him he was going to need a lot more zeros to buy my silence, and even then, my integrity was not for sale. Trent's face contorted with a fury so violent it was almost frightening. The mask of the polished politician completely disintegrated. He slammed both fists onto my desk, his voice erupting into a vicious shout. He told me I had made the biggest mistake of my miserable life. He pointed a trembling finger inches from my face. He said, "You think you are untouchable in this little office. You think because you wear a nice suit you can play hardball with me. You have no idea who you are dealing with." I sit on the golf course with the directors of the State Financial Board. I have the mayor on speed dial. My family owns half the commercial real estate in this city. I remained completely motionless, watching a man who was used to having the world handed to him realize he could not control me. Trent leaned in closer, his breath hot and ragged. He said, "I will personally make a few phone calls before lunchtime. I will have your CPA licenses revoked, pending a board investigation for unethical practices. I will freeze your business accounts. I will pressure every single client you have to drop your firm by the end of the week. I will ruin your livelihood, Zuri. I will strip you down to nothing until you are begging me for that 50 grand just to keep the lights on in this miserable little office." He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, his chest heaving with exertion. He pointed at the door. He told me I had 24 hours to get on board with the program to take the child and stay quiet. He said if I did not, he would completely destroy me. Trent turned on his heel and stormed out of my office, slamming the glass door so hard the walls vibrated. I sat alone in the quiet aftermath of his tantrum. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidated. I felt a cold, sharp sense of victory. Trent had just showed me his entire hand. He relied on intimidation, political connections, and the illusion of immense wealth to bully his way out of consequences. He saw a black woman running a boutique accounting firm and assumed I was a basic tax preparer. He assumed I was a low-level number cruncher who would fold under the pressure of white generational power. He had absolutely no idea what a forensic accountant actually did. He did not know that I spent my days dissecting the exact type of shell companies and offshore accounts that men like him used to hide their dirty money. He thought he could freeze my accounts. He did not realize I already had the tools to dismantle his entire financial existence. The war had escalated, and Trent had just given me permission to absolutely ruin him. Trent said he would make a few phone calls before lunchtime to ruin me. He did not even need that long. He simply outsourced the dirty work to the two people who possessed the most social capital in the city, my parents. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, my office phone rang. It was Deacon Wallace, the owner of a massive regional logistics company and my firm's oldest client. He did not ask how I was doing. He cleared his throat, his tone thick with awkward formality, and told me his board of directors had decided to transition their accounts to a different firm. When I pressed him for a reason, he gave a heavy sigh. He said he had tremendous respect for my father, Reverend Calvin, and that the church community was praying for my mental health. He advised me to take time off to deal with my hidden burdens and hung up the phone. 10 minutes later, a prominent real estate developer canceled her quarterly audit. Then a local black-owned restaurant franchise paused their retainer. The dominoes were falling with terrifying speed. Trent did not have to lift a finger to freeze my business accounts. He just let my parents unleash the full devastating weight of their social influence. In elite African American circles, reputation is an impenetrable currency. My parents sat at the very top of that hierarchy. They controlled the church board, they influenced the local chapter of the Lynx, and their voices carried absolute authority at every HBCU alumni gala in the state. If Reverend Calvin and Vivica Washington declared someone a liability, that person ceased to exist socially and professionally. My phone buzzed with a text message from my sorority sister Camille, who was currently watching Aaliyah at my penthouse. The message contained an audio file forwarded from a private church prayer group. I clicked play sitting alone in my rapidly emptying office. My mother's voice filled the room, trembling with a perfectly manufactured, heartbreaking sob. She was speaking to her inner circle of affluent church wives. She told them she needed their deepest, most discreet prayers for her eldest daughter. She painted a tragic, completely fabricated picture of my time in London 6 years ago. She claimed the pressure of the corporate world had broken my mind. She said I had suffered a severe mental breakdown and birthed a child out of wedlock, hiding the little girl away in secret facilities out of pure shame. Vivica's performance was Oscar-worthy. She cried about how she and Calvin had just discovered my dark secret and were trying desperately to intervene and get me psychiatric help. She framed Kendra as the supportive younger sister whose political husband Trent was graciously trying to fund my supposed rehabilitation. It was a masterclass in gaslighting and character assassination. They were flipping the narrative entirely. By framing me as a mentally unstable, ashamed mother who had hidden a child for 6 years, they instantly discredited anything I might say. If I went to the press or the congregation claiming Kendra was the real mother, I would just look like a delusional, jealous woman experiencing a psychotic break. My parents had effectively built a firewall around Kendra and Trent by throwing me straight into the flames. The social isolation settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My email inbox, usually overflowing with client requests and gala invitations, went completely dead. 2 of my junior accountants knocked on my door looking nervous, asking if the rumors about the firm closing were true. The tight-knit community I had grown up in, the people who had celebrated my firm's opening, were now locking their doors and looking the other way. I was being excommunicated from my own life. I left the office early. Walking through the quiet corridors of my firm, I felt the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. They were willing to bankrupt my business, destroy my professional credibility, and brand me a lunatic just to ensure Trent won a city council seat. When I unlocked the door to my penthouse, the quiet luxury of my home offered no immediate comfort. Camille was sitting at the kitchen island looking up at me with profound concern. She had heard the audio file. She knew the truth, but she also knew the terrifying power my parents wielded. I walked into the living room. Aaliyah was sitting on the thick rug building a small tower out of decorative wooden blocks she had found on a lower shelf. She was wearing one of my oversized college sweatshirts because we had not had time to buy her proper clothes yet. She looked up when I entered. Her dark eyes, a perfect reflection of my own, held a mixture of deep exhaustion and fearful uncertainty. She did not rush over to me. She stayed perfectly still as if waiting to be scolded or sent away. I knelt down on the rug beside her. I asked her what she was building. She pointed to a slightly crooked stack of blocks and whispered that she was trying to build a castle, but it kept falling down. I helped her steady the base blocks, my heart aching at the metaphor. I noticed the dark circles under her 6-year-old eyes. Camille had told me that Aaliyah barely ate her lunch and kept asking if Miss Brenda was coming back to get her or if Auntie Kendra was still mad at her. The trauma of being handed off to a paid nanny, hidden like a dirty secret, and then discarded at a school office was already taking root in her tiny mind. She had been conditioned to be quiet, to be unseen, to be a ghost in her own life. Looking at this beautiful, discarded child, the crushing weight of the social isolation vanished. The hurt I felt over my parents betraying me evaporated completely. You cannot be hurt by people you no longer respect. What took over was a fierce, protective, terrifying rage. My parents and Trent thought they could break me by taking away my clients and my social standing. They thought I would crumble under the weight of public humiliation and come crawling back to them begging for forgiveness and accepting my role as their permanent scapegoat. They were wrong. I watched Aaliyah carefully place a wooden block on top of our shared tower. I realized then that I was not just fighting for my own reputation anymore. I was fighting for her right to exist in the light. I was fighting to show this little girl that she was not a burden, a secret, or a political liability. She was blood, and she deserved a family that would go to war for her. I stood up from the rug, my resolve hardening into solid steel. I told Camille to stay with Aaliyah and order us the most expensive takeout she could find. I walked straight into my home office and locked the glass door behind me. I was done playing defense. I was done being the good, compliant daughter who swallowed the family poison to keep the peace. If Reverend Calvin and Vivica Washington wanted to cast me as a villain in their twisted public narrative, I was going to give them a villain they would never forget. They wanted to destroy my livelihood. I was going to dismantle their entire empire. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my encrypted contacts. I bypassed my usual corporate lawyers and standard investigators. I needed someone who operated in the shadows, someone who did not care about the Heritage Country Club or my father's pastoral collar. I tapped the name of my HBCU fraternity brother, DeAndre. It was time to follow the money. I dialed DeAndre's private number. DeAndre and I went way back to our undergraduate days at Howard University. While I spent my time mastering tax law and corporate audits, DeAndre was the guy who could find out exactly who was sleeping with whom, who was stealing from the student government budget, and who was lying about their background. Now he ran a high-end private investigation firm out of a nondescript office in Midtown. He did not care about social status, country club politics, or pastoral collars. He cared about facts, and he was absolutely ruthless when it came to digging up dirt on the untouchable elite. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed a ghost. I told him my family had just declared war on my business and my reputation, and I needed to dismantle a political campaign and a megachurch financial empire by the end of the week. DeAndre let out a low whistle. He told me to give him an hour and order some strong coffee. When DeAndre arrived at my penthouse, He bypassed the luxury decor and walked straight into my home office. He dropped a heavy encrypted laptop onto my desk. I handed him the forged birth certificate and explained the entire situation. I told him about Aaliyah sleeping in the guest room right down the hall. I told him about the vicious smear campaign my mother was running through the church prayer groups painting me as a lunatic. I told him about the $50,000 bribe Trent tried to shove down my throat just hours prior. DeAndre did not show shock. He just cracked his knuckles and asked where I wanted to start the demolition. I told him we are bypassing the police entirely. The police take months to build a fraud case, and Trent has enough political connections to stall a detective indefinitely. We are going straight for the financial jugular. I want every bank statement, every hidden credit line, and every offshore account connected to Trent Kendra and my father. We set up a war room right there in my office. I pulled up my dual monitors and booted up my proprietary forensic software. These were the exact same programs I used to gut fraudulent hedge funds and trace ghost money for federal audits. We started with my sister. Kendra always projected the image of a wealthy, unbothered political wife draped in designer brands and driving European sports cars. But numbers never lie. Within 2 hours, I breached her primary credit lines. The reality of her life was pathetic. Kendra was swimming in toxic consumer debt. Her credit cards were maxed out to the absolute limit. She had taken out high-interest personal loans just to maintain her country club wardrobe and pay for her expensive salon treatments. She was living invoice to invoice, completely dependent on the illusion of Trent's generational wealth to keep her creditors at bay. She had abandoned her own flesh and blood just to secure a lifestyle that was entirely financed by plastic. Next, I turned my attention to my father's pride and joy. The prestigious megachurch he had run for 2 decades was a cornerstone of the Black community in our city. Reverend Calvin Washington was universally respected for his leadership, particularly his massive ongoing campaign for a new community center. The church building fund was supposed to hold millions in donations from faithful, hard-working parishioners. I accessed the church's public tax filings and cross-referenced them with vendor payment records. DeAndre pulled from the dark web using his proprietary software. It took me less than an hour to spot the glaring anomalies. My father was running 2 sets of books. Massive sums of cash were being classified as administrative consulting fees and construction retainers, but the vendors listed did not actually exist. They were phantom companies registered to empty post office boxes in states hundreds of miles away. My father, the man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday demanding tithes and moral purity, was bleeding his own congregation dry. He was actively funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the sacred building fund. The hypocrisy made my stomach churn. He had threatened to throw me to the wolves to protect his reputation, all while he was robbing the very people who trusted him with their salvation. But where was the money going? That was the crucial question that brought us directly to Trent. Trent played the role of the independently wealthy heir perfectly. He presented himself as a man whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the city. He funded his city council campaign with what he proudly claimed was his own personal capital, refusing outside donations to prove he was an incorruptible public servant who could not be bought. I told DeAndre to isolate Trent's campaign finance filings while I traced the phantom vendor payments from my father's church. Trent had constructed a massive labyrinth of limited liability companies. He layered them like Russian nesting dolls, a classic strategy used by money launderers to obscure the original source of funds. A regular auditor would get lost in the paperwork, hitting dead end after dead end. But Trent was arrogant, and arrogant men always leave a digital fingerprint. I tracked a series of wire transfers moving from my father's church shell companies into a holding company registered in Delaware. From Delaware, the money splintered into a dozen different offshore accounts before routing back into the United States directly into Trent's primary campaign fund. I pointed at the screen showing DeAndre the undeniable transaction flow. I told him Trent is not self-funding his political campaign. He is using my father's church as a personal piggy bank. My father is embezzling, offering money from working-class families to finance his white son-in-law's political ambitions. DeAndre typed furiously on his encrypted laptop, running specialized decryption software to breach the final layer of Trent's corporate structure. We needed to see the actual account balances. We needed to know exactly how much Trent was hiding and who actually owned the properties he claimed as his untouchable generational wealth. The hours bled deep into the night. We drank pot after pot of black coffee surrounded by printed spreadsheets and digital wire logs. The silence in the office was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. I was fueled by a cold, calculating adrenaline. They had tried to paint me as a mentally unstable, shameful woman. They had treated Aaliyah like a piece of garbage to be swept under the rug. I was going to strip away every single ounce of their power. Suddenly, DeAndre let out a sharp gasp. He pushed his leather chair back from his desk, staring at his monitor with wide eyes. He called my name, his voice tight with absolute disbelief. I walked over to his side of the desk and looked at the glowing screen. DeAndre had finally cracked the heavy encryption on Trent's primary holding company, the master corporate entity that supposedly contained all of his vast family fortune. I read the balance sheets, my eyes scanning the heavily guarded financial data. I read it twice just to be absolutely sure I was not making a mistake. The numbers were staggering, but not in the way anyone in our elite social circle believed. Trent was not a millionaire. He did not own half the commercial real estate in the city. Every single property associated with his name was heavily mortgaged to the breaking point. He had taken out massive high-risk loans against properties that were already underwater. He was completely broke, drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, and entirely leveraged by ruthless private creditors. The grand illusion of his aristocratic wealth was nothing but a fragile house of cards, held together solely by the stolen cash he was siphoning from my father's church. My family had not just sold their souls for a powerful political alliance. They had sold their souls to a broke, desperate con artist. And I now held the match that would burn their entire kingdom to the ground. We stared at the screen as the true magnitude of the fraud settled over the room. Trent was a hollow shell of a man, his entire political and social existence bankrolled by the offerings of my father's congregation. But I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. I told DeAndre to pull the internal authorization forms for the church building fund. I needed to see how Trent was bypassing the church treasurers. DeAndre ran a script to pull the digitized administrative logs. He clicked open the PDF files containing the monthly wire transfer authorizations. Every single document routing money to Trent's offshore shell companies bore a signature. It was not a forgery this time. It was my father's bold, unmistakable handwriting. Reverend Calvin Washington had personally authorized every stolen dime. He was not a victim of Trent's manipulation. He was an active, willing accomplice. The motive was sickeningly clear. Calvin and Vivica were so blinded by the prestige of Trent's family name and his connections to white political royalty that they ignored every red flag. When they inevitably discovered Trent was secretly broke and drowning in debt, they faced a choice. They could cancel the wedding, expose the fraud, and face the humiliation of losing their elite social trajectory. Instead, they chose to fund his campaign with stolen church money. They sold out the working-class families in their congregation who donated to that building fund every Sunday. They sold out my identity to cover up Kendra's pregnancy so she would remain a pure, acceptable bride for a political campaign. They abandoned Aaliyah, all to protect a broke fraud who offered them proximity to power. DeAndre leaned back in his leather chair and shook his head. He said, "Your father is going to burn for this. The federal government does not play around with wire fraud and tax evasion on this scale." I walked over to my office window and looked out at the city lights. My family had spent my entire adult life underestimating me. They saw my tailored suits and my quiet demeanor and assumed I was just a glorified bookkeeper making a modest salary. They treated me like a peasant because I did not care about designer labels or country club gossip. They never bothered to learn that senior forensic accountants who dismantle corporate fraud rings command massive equity payouts. While my mother and sister were buying luxury vehicles on high-interest credit to maintain an illusion, I was aggressively investing in commercial real estate, emerging tech, and high-yield bonds. My net worth was quiet, but it was massive. I turned back to DeAndre. I told him to pull my parents' personal financial portfolio. If Trent was drowning in leverage and the church money was being funneled entirely into the political campaign, I needed to know how Calvin and Vivica were financing their lavish Heritage Hills estate. DeAndre's fingers flew across the keyboard, tapping into property tax records and credit monitoring databases. Within minutes, the brutal truth of their precious lifestyle illuminated the monitors. My parents were financially bleeding out. To pay for Kendra's fake Paris excursion, her extravagant wedding, and their endless country club dues, they had taken out a massive secondary mortgage on their estate. Worse, they had an adjustable rate mortgage with a balloon payment approaching rapidly, a payment they had absolutely no way of covering. The primary lender holding their mortgage was a regional bank that had recently come under federal scrutiny for poor lending practices. According to the financial news feeds I monitored daily, that specific bank was quietly offloading portfolios of distressed debt to private equity firms for pennies on the dollar to balance their books and avoid regulatory audits. A cold, predatory energy surged through my veins. I picked up my phone and dialed my private wealth manager. I knew he would be awake. In my tax bracket, wealth managers answer the phone at 3 in the morning. When he picked up, I gave him immediate, explicit instructions. I told him to form a blind limited liability company registered in Wyoming before the business day started, ensuring my name was nowhere on the public incorporation documents. Then I told him to contact the distressed asset division of that specific regional bank. I wanted to purchase the commercial debt portfolio containing the mortgage for the Heritage Hills estate, and I was going to pay for it entirely in cash. My wealth manager did not ask questions. He simply confirmed the routing numbers and initiated the legal paperwork. The transaction moved with the terrifying silent speed of liquid capital. Banks do not care about prestige, social standing, or pastoral collars. They care about clearing bad debt off their balance sheets. By mid-morning the next day, the wire transfer cleared. The legal assignment of the mortgage debt was officially transferred to my newly formed dummy corporation. I sat at my desk, holding the digital confirmation documents printed on thick, heavy paper. I owned the paper on the house where I grew up. I owned the roof over the heads of the people who had tried to destroy me. Reverend Calvin and Vivica Washington were currently sleeping in a sprawling mansion that legally belonged to me. I was officially their landlord. The moment they missed their next balloon payment, which I knew for an absolute fact they could not afford, without draining more stolen church funds, I had the absolute legal authority to foreclose, evict them, and seize the estate. Trent thought his $50,000 check was a display of dominance. He had no idea what real financial power looked like. I had just purchased the ultimate kill switch, and I was going to hold it directly over their heads until the perfect moment. I walked out of my office and went down the hall to the guest room. I gently pushed the door open. Camille was asleep in the armchair. Aaliyah was tucked into the large bed, clutching her worn teddy bear. Her breathing was soft and rhythmic, but even in sleep she looked tense, as if waiting for the next bad thing to happen. My family saw this beautiful, innocent child as a political liability to be hidden away and discarded. They were willing to sacrifice her entire existence on the altar of their ambition. I pulled the blanket up a little higher over her shoulders. I promised myself right then that nobody in the Washington family would ever have the power to hurt her again. I was not just building a case for identity theft anymore. I was preparing a total annihilation. The next morning began with a sharp warning. DeAndre called me before the sun even crested over the city skyline. His voice was tense and clipped. He told me we had tripped a digital alarm in Trent's financial labyrinth. Trent's private accountants had noticed unauthorized forensic inquiries brushing against the firewalls of his Delaware holding companies. The illusion of his wealth was being probed, and Trent had panicked. DeAndre tracked a sudden frantic flurry of encrypted phone calls at 2 in the morning. Trent called Kendra. Kendra called my mother Vivica. My father's private cell phone lit up minutes later. The rats were trapped in the maze and they knew someone was closing in. I thanked DeAndre and hung up the phone. I knew my family would not just sit back and wait for the hammer to fall. They were backed into a corner, terrified of losing their elite social standing and Trent's lucrative city council campaign. But I severely underestimated the depths of their moral bankruptcy. I assumed they would send high-priced lawyers to my accounting firm. I assumed they would try to threaten my business licenses again. Instead, they went straight for the weakest, most vulnerable target they could find. At 9 o'clock, the private intercom in my penthouse buzzed loudly. The voice of my building concierge trembled through the speaker. He apologized profusely, stating that law enforcement had bypassed the lobby desk and forced their way into the private elevator bank. Before I could even process his warning, 3 aggressive heavy knocks slammed against my front door. I walked across the hardwood floor and pulled the door open. Standing on my welcome mat was a stern woman, clutching a thick clipboard flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. The officers had their hands resting casually near their utility belts, their eyes scanning the perimeter of my entryway as if expecting an ambush. The woman introduced herself as Agent Rollins from Child Protective Services. She did not offer a polite greeting. She immediately demanded entry to the premises, citing an urgent anonymous hotline tip regarding a child in imminent danger. I stepped back and allowed them inside, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely unreadable. I know exactly how the world operates. I know how quickly a passionate, protective Black woman defending her home can be labeled as aggressive or hostile by law enforcement. I could not afford to give these officers a single excuse to escalate the situation. I had to be colder and sharper than the lies my family had spun. Agent Rollins stepped into my foyer and began reading from her clipboard. She stated that the anonymous tipster claimed I was an unmarried, deeply disturbed woman experiencing a severe psychotic break. The report alleged that I had abducted a 6-year-old child from a local private academy under false pretenses and was currently holding her hostage in an unsafe, hazardous environment. The tipster specifically demanded immediate emergency removal to state custody, citing a high risk of physical neglect and psychological abuse. The words hung in this pristine air of my penthouse. The report was a masterful, vicious piece of fiction. It mirrored Vivica's church gossip, flawlessly translating her tearful prayer group performance into a weaponized legal document. But as Agent Rollins read the allegations, the true terrifying motive behind the anonymous call crystallized in my mind. This was not a wellness check. This was a targeted tactical strike engineered by Trent and Kendra. They realized that as long as Aaliyah was safe in my custody, she was a living, breathing liability. Her physical presence in my home was a ticking time bomb for their political ambitions. If the police investigated the identity theft, a simple DNA test would definitively link the girl to Kendra. School registration documents would trace back to my stolen identity. Trent's campaign would be obliterated by the scandal of his wife abandoning her secret child. However, if Child Protective Services ripped Aaliyah out of my penthouse under emergency protocols, everything would change. Aaliyah would be thrown into the chaotic, overburdened foster care system. She would be classified as an emergency placement or a John Doe case until her legal identity could be verified. She would vanish into a maze of state bureaucracy. A DNA test would be delayed indefinitely. I would spend months fighting a hostile family court system just to prove the child was not legally mine, while simultaneously fighting to get her back out of the system. Trent would buy himself enough time to breeze through his city council election untouched. They were entirely willing to let a traumatized 6-year-old girl be swallowed by the foster system, bounced between strangers, and scarred for life, all to protect a white politician's campaign optics and my parents' country club reputation. The sheer depravity of their plan took my breath away. They did not just abandon Aaliyah at a school, they were actively weaponizing the state to erase her completely. The police officers stepped past me, their heavy boots thudding against the marble floors. They were clearly expecting to walk into a den of filth, chaos, and neglect. Instead, they stepped into a sprawling, sunlit penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the financial district. The air smelled like fresh coffee and the expensive lavender candles I burned in the mornings. The kitchen was immaculate, with a refrigerator fully stocked with fresh organic fruit and groceries. In the center of the living room, Camille was sitting cross-legged on the plush rug. She had a colorful new picture book spread open on the coffee table. Aaliyah was sitting right beside her, wearing a brand new soft pink sweater we had bought her the day before. She was carefully coloring in a picture of a butterfly, completely unharmed, completely safe, and entirely well cared for. When Aaliyah saw the uniformed police officers, she dropped her crayon. Her tiny shoulders tensed and she shrank back against the sofa. The trauma of her sudden displacement from the only life she knew was still incredibly fresh. She looked at the heavy utility belts and the stern faces of the officers, and her eyes, wide with fear, darted immediately to me. I stepped smoothly between the law enforcement officers and the little girl. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute authority in my tone brought the officers to a halt. I told them they could inspect every single inch of my home, but they were not going to terrify a child who had already been through enough. Agent Rollins looked around the immaculate penthouse, her professional skepticism wavering as she took in the stark contrast between the vicious, anonymous tip and the peaceful reality of my home. She looked at my tailored blazer, my pristine environment, and the calm, supportive presence of Camille. The narrative Trent and Kendra had carefully constructed was already beginning to fracture. I knew my family expected me to panic. They expected me to yell, to argue, to look exactly like the unhinged, dangerous woman they claimed I was. They expected the police to drag a crying child out of my arms while I unraveled. But I am a forensic accountant. I build my life on documentation, undeniable proof, and airtight evidence. Trent thought he could outmaneuver me with a cheap anonymous phone call. He had no idea I was about to drop an anvil on his entire strategy. I stepped toward the kitchen island and gestured for Agent Rollins to take a seat at the quartz counter. I did not offer her coffee or water. This was a business transaction, and I was about to close the account. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the nearby stool and pulled out a heavy, thick portfolio. I slid it across the smooth stone surface until it rested directly in front of her. I told her I understood she had a difficult job to do, but I also valued extreme efficiency. I told her to open the binder. Agent Rollins hesitated, her professional skepticism still fully engaged, but she flipped the heavy cover open. Inside was a masterclass in forensic documentation. I had not just spent the last 24 hours comforting a traumatized child. I had methodically established an impenetrable paper trail of my financial, legal, and domestic stability. I walked her through the tabs with cold, clinical precision. Tab 1 contained my personal and business bank statements, proving I possessed the liquid capital to raise a child 10 times over without breaking a single sweat. Tab 2 held a copy of my pristine criminal background check, a strict requirement for maintaining my high-level corporate auditing licenses. Tab 3 contained the emergency pediatric appointment I had already scheduled for Aaliyah with one of the most exclusive private doctors in the city, fully paid in advance. Tab 4 held the expedited paperwork I had already drafted with my legal team to pursue emergency sole custody. I watched the stern defensive lines on Agent Rollins' face soften into genuine confusion. She looked from the impeccable financial and medical records over to the living room. Aaliyah was now giggling softly at something Camille had whispered to her, carefully coloring a bright yellow butterfly on the coffee table. Agent Rollins closed the portfolio. She let out a long breath and admitted that the scene in front of her completely contradicted the severe, alarming allegations in the hotline report. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the counter, closing the physical distance between us. I told her the report was a complete fabrication. It was a calculated, malicious hit job. I explained that the person who called her agency was not a concerned citizen worried about a child's welfare. The caller was a desperate, broke political candidate trying to bury a massive family secret before Election Day. Agent Rollins frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. She asked why a politician would weaponize Child Protective Services against me. I reached into my tailored blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I told her that my profession requires me to document absolutely everything, especially when a hostile, entitled man barges into my private office uninvited and attempts to bribe me. I opened my encrypted voice memos application. I selected the audio file from yesterday morning, turned the volume all the way to maximum, and pressed play. The pristine acoustics of my penthouse amplified every single word. Trent's arrogant, aggressive voice echoed off the marble walls and high ceilings. The recording captured everything with terrifying clarity. Agent Rollins heard the sound of him slamming his heavy hands onto my desk. She heard his patronizing, cruel tone as he referred to Aaliyah as a bastard kid. She heard the crisp, unmistakable tearing sound as he wrote out the check. Then came the damning climax of the audio. Trent's voice filled my kitchen, explicitly telling me to take the $50,000. She heard him order me to buy the kid a wardrobe, put her in a private school, keep her completely hidden from the public, and protect Kendra's pristine image. She heard him say that everybody wins as long as I keep my mouth shut. I let the recording play right up to the moment Trent violently threatened to destroy my business licenses and ruin my livelihood if I did not comply with his demands. Then I pressed pause. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I looked directly into Agent Rollins' eyes. I said the man on that recording is Trent. He is currently running for city council, and he is married to my sister Kendra, the woman who actually gave birth to the little girl sitting in my living room. I explained that they stole my identity to hide the pregnancy years ago, and when they could no longer afford to pay the secret nanny, they abandoned her at a private academy. I told her they called Child Protective Services because they wanted Aaliyah swallowed by the state foster system before the press or his wealthy donors could find her. They used her agency as a political cleanup crew. Agent Rollins sat completely frozen. The color had drained entirely from her face. As a social worker who spent her life fighting in the trenches for vulnerable, abused children, listening to a wealthy politician casually try to purchase a child's erasure was entirely repulsive to her. The professional detachment she walked in with completely vanished, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. She picked up her pen, opened her official clipboard, and drew a thick, aggressive diagonal line straight across the anonymous tip report. She wrote the word unfounded in bold capital letters right at the top of the page. She packed her things back into her briefcase with sharp, definitive movements. She looked at me with profound respect. She said she had seen a lot of incredibly ugly things in her career, but weaponizing the child welfare system to protect a political campaign was a new low. She reached into her blazer pocket and handed me her personal business card. Agent Rollins told me she was closing the case immediately and permanently. She stated for the record that Aaliyah was clearly in the safest, most capable hands possible. Then she lowered her voice, leaning in close. She told me that filing a false report with Child Protective Services is a serious crime. She said if I decided to file police charges for harassment, extortion, and identity theft, I should give her a call directly. She promised to personally testify on my behalf in any courtroom, and she offered to hand over the original hotline recording to the detectives to match the voice to Trent or my mother. I took her card and thanked her. I walked her and the two police officers back to the front door. The officers who had stood silently near the foyer listening to the entire audio recording gave me nods of silent, solid support before stepping into the private elevator. I locked the heavy door behind them. The silence in the penthouse was no longer tense or frightening. It was the calm before a massive, destructive storm. Trent had fired his absolute biggest weapon, and it had backfired spectacularly. He thought he was sending agents to take Aaliyah away from me. Instead, he had just handed me a furious government witness willing to testify to his corruption. I walked back into the living room. Camille looked up at me from the floor, a fierce, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She said they have absolutely no idea who they are messing with. I smiled back, feeling the weight of the upcoming battle settle comfortably onto my shoulders. I told Camille they were about to find out very soon. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an email notification. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The trap was setting itself. The heavy wooden door of my penthouse clicked shut behind the police officers and the child welfare agent. The silence that followed was completely different from the tense, terrifying quiet of the morning. This was the quiet of a battlefield right after the enemy artillery had spectacularly misfired. Camille stood up from the rug, her eyes wide with a fierce, triumphant energy, but I did not have time to celebrate. I walked over to the entryway console to sort through the morning mail that the concierge had brought up. Right on top of a stack of corporate tax briefs was a thick, cream-colored envelope lined with heavy gold foil. I picked it up and broke the wax seal. Inside was a formal invitation to the Heritage Coalition annual gala. It was the premier fundraising event of the season, hosted at the Grand Magnolia Hotel. Tickets were $1,000 a plate, and the guest of honor, the man delivering the keynote address on community integrity and family values, was Trent. He had not invited me, of course. My accounting firm was on an automated mailing list for prominent Black-owned businesses in the city. Trent had probably tried to strike my name from the registry, but the event organizers operated independently of his campaign staff. He likely assumed that after sending a government agency to rip a child from my home, I would be too terrified, too humiliated, or too busy dealing with the legal fallout to ever show my face in public again. He assumed I was currently sitting on my floor crying over the mess he had created. He was dead wrong. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. I typed in the URL listed at the bottom of the gold foil card. The RSVP portal glowed brightly on my monitor. I typed in my full name. I checked the box requesting a +1. Under the guest name category, I typed Aaliyah Washington. Dietary restrictions, none. I hit submit and listened to the soft whir of my laser printer spitting out the confirmation barcode with 2 designated seats at a premium table. The trap was officially set. But RSVPing was just optics. It was a psychological play. I needed impenetrable armor. If I walked into a ballroom filled with the city elite, the mayor and Trent's wealthy aristocratic family holding a child, I had no legal claim over Trent would panic. He would not just call security, he would call the actual police. He would leverage his political connections to claim I had abducted his niece, overriding the dismissed child welfare report. He would try to rip Aaliyah out of my hands right there on the ballroom floor, turning my moment of victory into a chaotic, traumatizing spectacle for the little girl. I could not let that happen. I needed a piece of paper that made me an absolute fortress. I needed ironclad, indisputable custody, and I needed to sever Kendra completely. I picked up my phone and called DeAndre. I told him I needed a judge. I did not need a corporate mediator or a friendly family court magistrate. I needed a judge who could not be bought, intimidated, or swayed by Trent's generational wealth. DeAndre let out a deep, rumbling laugh that vibrated through the speaker. He told me he knew exactly who we needed. Honorable Judge Rosalind Carter. She was a veteran of the bench, a fierce Howard University alumna, and a woman with a very long, very unforgiving memory. 2 years ago, Trent's father had financed a dark money political action committee that ran a vicious racially coded smear campaign to block Judge Carter's appointment to the state appellate court. She despised Trent's entire political bloodline with a passion that burned hotter than the sun. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, DeAndre had cashed in a massive favor to secure me a closed-door, off-the-books meeting in Judge Carter's private chambers. I left Aaliyah safely at the penthouse baking cookies with Camille. I walked into the downtown courthouse wearing my sharpest tailored suit, carrying the heavy leather portfolio that held the destruction of my family's empire. Judge Carter was sitting behind a massive oak desk, her judicial robes draped casually over the back of her chair. She looked at me with a stern, calculating gaze. She asked why a corporate forensic accountant was demanding an emergency ex parte custody hearing off the official docket. I did not waste her time with emotional pleas or family drama. I spoke her language. I spoke in undeniable evidence. I slid the forged birth certificate across her desk. I showed her the professional handwriting analysis. Then I pulled out my phone and played the audio recording of Trent slamming his fists on my desk and offering $50,000 to hide a child to protect his campaign. Judge Carter listened to the recording without moving a single muscle. Her expression turned to absolute stone. She recognized Trent's arrogant, entitled voice instantly. Then I pulled out the final, devastating piece of leverage. I showed her the preliminary wire transfer logs connecting my father's church building fund to Trent's offshore campaign accounts. I told her this was the man attempting to leverage state agencies to disappear a 6-year-old girl. The judge did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She pulled a stack of emergency injunction forms toward her. She stated for the official record that Kendra Washington had committed felony identity theft and abandoned a minor child, creating an immediate and severe risk of harm. With 3 swift, aggressive strokes of her pen, she signed the emergency order. She granted me temporary sole physical and legal custody of Aaliyah. She officially suspended Kendra's parental rights pending a full federal investigation into the identity fraud. Judge Carter handed the stamped certified documents back to me. She looked me dead in the eye and told me to burn their house to the ground. I walked out of the courthouse holding the legal equivalent of a nuclear launch code. Trent could not call the cops on me. He could not claim kidnapping. If he tried to lay a single finger on Aaliyah, he would be violating a direct certified order from a superior court judge. The legal cage was fully built. Now it was time to decorate the execution. I returned to the penthouse and told Camille we were going shopping. Aaliyah had spent her entire short life being treated like a dirty secret hidden away in back rooms, dressed in whatever was cheapest and least noticeable so she would not draw attention. That era ended today. We drove to an exclusive children's boutique in the upscale shopping district. I bought Aaliyah a stunning custom-tailored dress in a deep, rich crimson. It was a dress made for a princess, a dress that demanded attention and respect. I bought myself a matching tailored crimson suit. We were not going to blend into the shadows of the ballroom. We were going to walk through the front doors looking like royalty. We were going to look like a family that could not be erased. The evening of the gala was rapidly approaching. The trap was perfectly laid. The financial records were compiled, the custody papers were certified, and the truth was loaded in the chamber, ready to fire. Trent and my parents thought they had silenced me. They thought the child welfare stunt had scared me into submission. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to walk right into the center of their pristine, wealthy world and turn their entire kingdom into ashes. The emergency custody order from Judge Carter was a brilliant, impenetrable shield. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in temporary solutions. Temporary orders can be challenged, appealed, and dragged through the mud of the family court system by high-priced lawyers fighting for a political candidate's reputation. I needed a permanent, indestructible fortress. I needed Kendra's parental rights severed completely legally and permanently before I ever set foot inside that gala. I brought Aaliyah back to the penthouse, handed her over to Camille to try on her new crimson dress, and immediately converted my dining room into a legal war room. I called in Marcus. Marcus was not a family law attorney. He was the most ruthless corporate litigator on my firm's payroll, a man who specialized in hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and burying corrupt executives under mountains of undeniable evidence. I did not need a mediator. I needed an executioner. When Marcus arrived, I laid the entire arsenal on the table. I gave him the forged birth certificate, the handwriting analysis, the audio recording of Trent's $50,000 bribe, the logs of the anonymous Child Protective Services call, and Judge Carter's emergency injunction. I told Marcus that I wanted Kendra's parental rights irrevocably terminated by Friday afternoon. Marcus looked over the documents, his sharp eyes taking in the sheer volume of felony fraud my family had committed. He adjusted his suit and smiled a cold, calculating smile. He told me that family court is usually a slow, grinding machine, but when you introduce the threat of federal prison for identity theft and document forgery, people become remarkably cooperative. We did not file a public motion. We executed a surgical behind-the-scenes strike. Marcus directly contacted the discreet private attorney Kendra kept on retainer for her country club non-disclosure agreements and minor social liabilities. We bypassed Trent entirely. Kendra's lawyer was summoned to an off-the-books meeting in Marcus's downtown office. Marcus slid a thick, aggressively drafted legal packet across the conference table. It contained a voluntary, irrevocable relinquishment of all parental rights, transferring permanent, uncontested sole legal and physical custody of Aaliyah to me. Attached to the back of the custody agreement was a meticulously drafted criminal complaint outlining Kendra's identity fraud forgery and child abandonment, fully prepared and ready to be filed with the district attorney. Marcus gave Kendra's lawyer a brutal ultimatum. He stated that Kendra could sign the surrender documents quietly, permanently signing away the child she had already discarded, and we would delay filing the criminal fraud charges. If she refused, or if she tried to stall the criminal complaint, would be hand-delivered to the prosecutor's office, the press, and Trent's top political donors before the end of the business day. The response was tragically, sickeningly predictable. Kendra was entirely consumed by her own vanity, her desperation to remain a wealthy political wife, and her terror of facing actual consequences. She did not fight for Aaliyah. She did not express a single ounce of maternal remorse. Faced with the immediate threat of federal prison and the total destruction of her country club lifestyle, she panicked. Less than 4 hours after Marcus issued the ultimatum, a courier arrived at my penthouse. Inside a sealed, heavy envelope were the custody documents. Kendra had signed every single page. Her pageant perfect signature, the same exact handwriting she had used to forge my name 6 years ago, was stamped, notarized, and legally binding. She had voluntarily and permanently severed all legal ties to her daughter. Kendra thought she was signing away a political liability. She believed she had successfully swept her biggest, darkest mistake under the rug. She thought she had outsmarted the system, avoided a felony charge, and secured her place at Trent's side for his glorious election night. She had absolutely no idea that she had just surrendered her only piece of leverage. By signing those papers, she handed me the ultimate untouchable authority over Aaliyah's life. With the custody issue permanently resolved, I turned my attention back to the financial demolition. DeAndre was still running deep surveillance on Trent's digital footprint. He called me late Thursday night with an update that made me laugh out loud in the quiet of my office. DeAndre reported that Trent was completely oblivious to the legal strike we had just executed against his wife. Trent was operating under the arrogant, delusional assumption that his anonymous call to Child Protective Services had worked perfectly. Because my penthouse had gone radio silent, and because I had not retaliated publicly, Trent assumed I was terrified. He assumed I was currently drowning in state bureaucracy, fighting to keep a child out of foster care, and far too intimidated to ever challenge his authority again. DeAndre intercepted emails between Trent and his campaign manager. Trent was bragging. He was organizing the final catering details for his grand fundraising gala, securing premium champagne, and finalizing his keynote speech on community integrity and family values. He was preparing to stand on a stage and present himself as the moral savior of the city, completely unaware that the ground beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes was totally hollow. I spent the next 24 hours assembling the physical evidence of their destruction. I purchased 3 sleek black leather portfolios. I am a woman who appreciates presentation, and I wanted my family to feel the full, undeniable weight of their ruin. In the first portfolio, I placed the certified irrevocable custody documents alongside the clear forensic proof of Kendra's identity theft. In the second portfolio, I placed the meticulously highlighted banking ledgers proving Trent had embezzled $250,000 from Reverend Calvin's church building fund, complete with my father's authorizing signatures. In the third and final portfolio, I placed the commercial property deed for the Heritage Hills estate. The bank had officially transferred the title of my parents' sprawling, luxurious mansion to my blind corporation. The paperwork was pristine, legal, and absolute. I was holding the keys to their kingdom in a manila folder. I locked the 3 portfolios inside my briefcase. The legal cage was not just built, it was reinforced with titanium. I had stripped away their financial stability, their parental rights, and their false moral authority. I had purchased their debt and secured their secrets. I walked out of my office and into the living room. Aaliyah was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, admiring her new crimson dress. The deep, rich color brought out the warmth in her complexion. She twirled slightly, the premium fabric flaring out around her knees. She looked up at me, a genuine bright smile breaking through the lingering shadows of her trauma. I knelt down and adjusted the collar of her dress. I told her she looked incredibly beautiful, stronger and braver than anyone else in our family. I promised her that after tonight she would never have to hide in the background ever again. She would never have to pretend she did not belong. We were going to step directly into the light, and we were going to make sure everyone knew exactly who she was. The calm before the inferno had passed. The legal preparations were flawless, the evidence was airtight, and my patience was entirely exhausted. It was time to put on my matching crimson suit, take my daughter by the hand, and walk straight into the lion's den. I stepped out of the boutique and handed Aaliyah's garment bag to my driver. I told him to take the dress up to the penthouse where Camille was waiting. I needed a moment of absolute quiet to focus my mind before the evening began, so I walked the half block to my regular artisanal coffee shop in the financial district. The air was crisp, the city bustling around me, completely oblivious to the financial and social execution I was preparing to host in just a few hours. I walked into the cafe, ordered a double espresso, and turned around. Standing directly between me and the exit was my mother. Vivica Washington did not do public coffee shops. She despised anything that lacked velvet seating table service or an exclusive membership fee. Her presence here meant she had been staking out my building, tracking my movements like a desperate creditor. She wore a tailored ivory cashmere coat, her hair immaculately pressed, but her oversized designer sunglasses could not hide the frantic, rigid tightness around her mouth. The polished, unbothered church First Lady facade was visibly cracking. She reached out to grab my arm. It was her signature move of maternal control, a physical demand for compliance. I sidestepped her smoothly, letting her manicured hand grasp empty air. I took my espresso from the barista, walked over to a quiet, isolated table in the corner, and sat down. I did not invite her to join me, but she followed anyway, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished concrete floor. She slid into the chair opposite me, leaning across the small table to drop her voice into a conspiratorial, desperate whisper. She told me we needed to talk. She said I was letting things get completely out of hand. She tried to frame Trent weaponizing Child Protective Services as a simple misunderstanding, claiming he was just stressed about the campaign and acting protectively over his family. She actually had the audacity to call it a minor lapse in judgment. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. The bitterness was perfect. I set the cup down and looked her dead in the eye. I told her that sending government agents to kidnap a 6-year-old child and throw her into the state foster system is not a lapse in judgment. It is a calculated, malicious felony. Vivica scoffed, rolling her eyes, as if I were overreacting to a spilled glass of water. She leaned closer, her perfume suffocating in the small space. She switched tactics, abandoning the fake maternal warmth and unleashing the ruthless social climber underneath. She brought up the gala tonight. She told me the entire ballroom would be packed with the city elite. She listed them off like a shield of armor. The mayor was attending. The top-tier donors from the country club were attending. Trent's aristocratic generational wealth parents were flying in on a private jet. She said this night was the culmination of everything our family had worked for, the exact moment Kendra and Trent would cement their political dynasty. Then she pointed a trembling finger at me. She said, "You have always been jealous of Kendra. Ever since you were little girls, you resented her beauty. You resented her charm. You resented how easily she could secure a powerful man. You bury yourself in your accounting firm because you are lonely and bitter, and now you want to tear down your sister's happiness just to make yourself feel powerful." She told me I was trying to ruin Kendra's life out of pure, spiteful jealousy. I looked at the woman who birthed me. I searched my chest for a spark of heartbreak, a sting of rejection, or even the familiar urge to seek her approval. I found absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation that had controlled me for 3 decades was completely dead. I placed my hands flat on the table. I kept my voice so chillingly calm, so entirely devoid of emotion that Vivica physically recoiled in her chair. I told her I was not jealous of a woman who was drowning in toxic consumer debt. I told her I did not envy a sister who had maxed out her credit cards just to buy designer bags to impress a congregation of hypocrites. I told her I certainly did not envy a woman married to a broke, leveraged fraud who had to embezzle $250,000 from his father-in-law's church just to afford his campaign flyers. Vivica gasped, the color instantly draining from her face. Her hand flew to her chest. She realized in that exact second that I did not just know about the identity theft. I knew about the money. I knew about the rot underneath their entire empire. She started to panic. The polished matriarch dissolved into a terrified, cornered animal. She reached across the table, her voice cracking as she begged me. She told me if I walked through those ballroom doors tonight and caused a scene, I would destroy the family name forever. She said the church would suffer. She said my father would be ruined and might face federal charges. She pleaded with me, asking how I could do this to my own blood, how I could be so cruel to my own mother. I leaned forward, closing the remaining distance between us. I told her she destroyed the family name the second she helped forge my signature on a state document. I told her she ruined herself the day she looked at her own granddaughter and decided the little girl was disposable. I told her she was not my mother anymore. She was just a woman standing in my way. I picked up my espresso cup and took one final sip. I stood up from the table, adjusting the lapel of my crimson suit. I looked down at Vivica, who was now visibly shaking in her chair, her ivory coat suddenly looking like a cheap costume. I told her to tell Trent to save me a seat near the front. I told her I was not just coming to the gala. I was bringing the true guest of honor, and I was bringing every single receipt they thought they had buried. I turned my back on her and walked out of the coffee shop, stepping back into the crisp city air. The ambush had failed. The guilt trip had evaporated. I had given her a clear, undeniable promise of the destruction awaiting them. I walked back toward my penthouse to pick up Aaliyah. It was time to get dressed for war. I pulled up to the Grand Magnolia Hotel just as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble facade. The valet rushed forward to open the door of my town car. I stepped out first, adjusting the sharp, structured lapel of my tailored crimson suit. I reached back in and gently took Aaliyah's hand. She stepped onto the pavement, the layered tulle of her matching crimson dress catching the evening breeze. We looked like a match set, a unified front entirely unbreakable. I gave Aaliyah a reassuring squeeze and told her to stand tall. I promised her that no one in this building could hurt her. She looked up at me, her dark eyes reflecting the sparkling lights of the hotel canopy, and nodded. We walked through the ornate glass doors into the bustling lobby. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, heavily catered food, and the distinct nervous energy of high-stakes political networking. I did not look left or right. I kept my posture rigid, and my gaze fixed entirely forward, cutting a path straight toward the grand ballroom. Inside the gala was a masterclass in performative morality. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm golden glow. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of premium champagne. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the absolute peak of the city elite. The mayor sat at a central table flanked by wealthy real estate developers and prominent local business owners. Trent's aristocratic generational wealth parents occupied a raised VIP booth near the stage, looking down on the crowd with practiced benevolent smiles. At the very front, occupying the best table in the house, sat my parents. Reverend Calvin and Vivica Washington were absolutely glowing, soaking up the prestige and the proximity to power. They looked like royalty, completely unaware that their throne was built on quicksand. On the massive raised stage at the far end of the ballroom, Trent stood behind a polished podium. The political banners behind him proudly displayed his campaign slogan, "Integrity, Family, Community." He was in the middle of a booming, charismatic speech. I could hear his amplified voice projecting across the room, talking about the sacred duty of fatherhood, the importance of honest leadership, and the traditional values that built this great city. Kendra sat exactly one step behind him, playing the role of the devoted, demure political wife to absolute perfection. She wore a modest, expensive pearl-colored gown, nodding along to Trent's empty promises, with a soft, supportive smile. I signaled to the usher standing by the heavy, brass-handled double doors at the back of the ballroom. I did not ask for permission to enter. I simply nodded for him to pull them open. The heavy doors swung wide, groaning slightly on their hinges. I stepped into the grand ballroom, Aaliyah's small hand gripped firmly in mine. The visual contrast was immediate and entirely intentional. In a sea of muted tuxedos, navy evening gowns, and safe conservative political attire, our vibrant matching crimson suits cut through the room like a warning siren. We did not blend in, we demanded absolute attention. I began walking down the central aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. Aaliyah walked right beside me, matching my steady pace. It started near the back tables. A low, confused murmur as a few guests turned around. Then someone from my parents' church recognized my face. The murmur turned into a sharp, startled whisper. The whispering spread like a shockwave, rolling forward through the crowd table by table as people noticed the 6-year-old girl walking beside me. The resemblance was too striking to ignore. Aaliyah looked exactly like a Washington, but she had never been seen in public. The city elite are incredibly observant, and gossip is their native language. I could almost hear the mental calculations happening in real time as hundreds of wealthy donors stared at us. Trent was in the middle of a sentence about prioritizing the youth of our community when his eyes flicked toward the back of the room. He saw the crimson suits. He saw me. And then he saw the child. The microphone caught the sharp, panicked hitch in his breath. His charismatic smile vanished instantly. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. His political speech derailed completely, leaving a sudden suffocating silence hanging over the massive ballroom. Kendra noticed his panic and followed his gaze. The pearl-colored gown suddenly looked sickly against her skin as all the blood drained from her face. She took a reflexive step backward, bumping into the political banner behind her. My parents, alerted by the sudden silence on stage, turned around in their seats. Vivica's hand flew to her throat, her designer clutch slipping from her lap and clattering onto the floor. Calvin stood up halfway, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. I did not stop walking. I did not break eye contact with the stage. I guided Aaliyah straight down the center aisle, parting the sea of the city's most powerful people, marching directly into the heart of the kingdom they had built on her erasure. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was absolutely deafening. The only sound was the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished hardwood floor. Aaliyah walked perfectly in step beside me, her small hand securely wrapped in mine. The sea of wealthy donors parted for us, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. On the stage, Trent was visibly disintegrating. The polished, charismatic politician had vanished. He was gripping the edges of the wooden podium so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. A sharp, high-pitched squeal of audio feedback pierced the air as he fumbled with the microphone. Trent looked down at his campaign manager standing near the front row. He gave a frantic, desperate nod, then darted his eyes toward the perimeter of the room. It was the universal silent command of the elite class when they encounter a problem they cannot buy their way out of. Eliminate the threat. Instantly, the heavy doors of the ballroom swung shut behind us. Two massive security guards detached themselves from the shadows of the velvet curtains and began moving down the aisle. They were built like brick walls, wearing custom black suits with coiled earpieces discreetly tucked behind their ears. The head of security, a towering man with a thick neck and a stern, uncompromising glare, took the lead. His trajectory was locked entirely on me. From the front row, I saw my mother let out a long, heavy exhale. Vivica adjusted the emerald silk of her gown and offered a tight, relieved smile to the wealthy real estate developer sitting next to her. She thought her nightmare was over. She thought her rogue, unstable daughter was about to be quickly and quietly escorted out the back service elevator before any real damage could be done. Kendra actually let go of her pearl necklace, her shoulders dropping as she watched the muscle close in on me. They all believed that brute force and country club authority would easily silence the truth. They forgot that I do not play by their rules. I do not argue with muscle, and I never enter a battlefield without holding the master key. The head of security stepped directly into my path, completely blocking the center aisle just 20 feet from the stage. His partner flanked him, cutting off any potential exit. The head guard folded his large hands in front of him. He kept his voice low, aiming for a discreet but highly intimidating tone. He told me that this was a private ticketed event. He said my name was not on the cleared donor list for the evening, and he politely but firmly insisted that I turn around and accompany him to the lobby immediately. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a single sudden movement that would give them an excuse to lay a hand on me. Aaliyah squeezed my fingers, a tiny spike of anxiety running through her small body as the towering men loomed over us. I squeezed her hand back, keeping my gaze warm and steady as I looked down at her. I told her softly that everything was perfectly fine, and these gentlemen were just doing their jobs. I looked back up at the head of security. I kept my posture entirely relaxed, but radiating absolute authority. I told him I deeply respected his commitment to protocol, but he was operating under outdated instructions. I reached my free hand into the inner pocket of my tailored crimson blazer. The guards tensed slightly, ready to react, but I moved slowly and deliberately. I pulled out a single heavy sheet of premium parchment paper. It was folded neatly in thirds. I did not hand him a ticket. I did not hand him a printed RSVP confirmation. I handed him an executive directive. During my forensic dive into Trent's financial ruins, I had mapped out every single corporate entity connected to this political gala. The Grand Magnolia Hotel was the crown jewel of the city, but it was owned and managed by a massive international hospitality conglomerate. That same conglomerate happened to be one of the top-tier clients at my boutique accounting firm. Just 8 months prior, I had personally led a brutal, microscopic audit that caught a rogue chief financial officer embezzling millions from their commercial property division. My forensic work had saved the conglomerate from a devastating federal tax penalty and kept their billionaire chief executive officer out of a massive shareholder lawsuit. The CEO owed me a tremendous unpayable debt. I had made exactly one phone call this afternoon. The document I handed to the security chief was printed on the conglomerate's highest-level corporate letterhead. It bore the heavy gold embossed seal of the parent company. At the bottom of the page was the wet ink signature of the billionaire owner himself. The directive was explicitly clear. It stated that Zuri Washington was acting as a proxy representative of the ownership board for the duration of the evening. It granted me absolute, unrestricted, and unquestionable authority over the premises, superseding any private event contracts, campaign managers, or local politicians. The head of security took the paper. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the sharp black text. I watched his face transform in real time. The rigid, intimidating scowl dissolved into pure, unfiltered shock. His eyes locked onto the gold seal, and then dropped to the signature. He knew exactly whose name was at the bottom of that page. He knew the man who signed his paychecks had just ordered him to treat me like the owner of the building. The guard looked up from the paper and stared at me. He saw the immaculate tailoring of my crimson suit. He saw my absolute lack of fear. He saw the cold, untouchable power radiating from my stance. He realized in that split second that Trent was just a broke politician renting a ballroom for the night, but I was the woman who held the keys to the entire castle. He carefully folded the document and handed it back to me with a reverence bordering on fear. He immediately tapped his earpiece. His voice echoed clearly in the silent, breathless tension of the ballroom. He ordered his entire security detail to stand down immediately. He explicitly commanded them to classify me as a maximum clearance VIP guest and to ensure I had an unobstructed path to wherever I wanted to go. Then this massive, imposing wall of a man took 2 large steps backward. He bowed his head slightly, sweeping his arm out toward the stage in a gesture of profound respect, yielding the floor completely to me and my daughter. A collective gasp ripped through the front rows. My mother dropped her jaw, completely losing whatever was left of her polished composure. My father gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning white as he watched his impenetrable security barrier literally bow to me and walk away. They had anticipated a loud, messy scene where I was dragged out kicking and screaming like a discarded liability. Instead, they were watching the hotel staff treat me like an emperor. On the stage, Trent looked like a man watching a train barrel directly toward him. The panic in his eyes morphed into pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the retreating security guards, then down at his campaign manager, who was frantically swiping at his phone with trembling hands. Trent had absolutely no backup left. His money was an illusion, his political power was a facade, and his physical defenses had just abandoned him on my command. I slid the executive directive back into my blazer pocket. I looked at Aaliyah and gave her a bright, confident smile. I told her we had a stage to catch. We resumed our walk down the center aisle, leaving the stunned security guards in our wake. Every step brought me closer to the podium, closer to the microphone, and closer to the total annihilation of the family that had tried to erase us. We reached the carpeted steps leading up to the main platform. Aaliyah squeezed my hand, seeking a moment of reassurance in the blinding glare of the stage lights. I squeezed back a silent promise that we were invincible and guided her up the stairs. Trent was backed against his wooden podium, his tailored suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. He raised a trembling hand, opening his mouth to issue an order to the retreating security guards, but no sound came out. The sheer, unapologetic velocity of my approach had completely short-circuited his brain. I did not ask for permission to speak. I reached out, gripped the sleek metal stand, and ripped the microphone straight from its mount. The sudden screech of audio feedback echoed through the grand ballroom, a piercing sound that made several wealthy donors in the front row flinch and cover their ears. That sharp, grating noise finally snapped Trent out of his paralysis. His political survival instinct kicked in, overriding his fear. He lunged toward me, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate snarl. He reached out with both hands, trying to grab the microphone, and physically shoved me away from the center of the stage. He never even made it past the podium. From the shadows of the VIP tables, a massive, impeccably dressed figure stepped directly onto the stage. DeAndre. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that stretched tightly across his broad shoulders, moving with the terrifying explosive speed of a former college linebacker. He planted himself firmly between Trent and me, placing one massive hand flat against Trent's chest. DeAndre did not have to push him. He just stopped him cold, treating the desperate politician like a minor, pathetic inconvenience. DeAndre leaned in and told Trent to stand completely still if he wanted to walk out of this ballroom with any teeth left. Trent froze instantly. His eyes darted from DeAndre to the audience, entirely emasculated and physically overpowered in front of his most vital financial backers. With Trent neutralized, I stepped to the very edge of the stage. The grand ballroom was dead silent. The clinking of champagne glasses had stopped. The whispers had vanished. Every single eye in that massive room was locked entirely on me. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces. I saw the mayor sitting rigidly at his center table, his mouth slightly ajar, his political instincts already calculating the blast radius of this disaster. I saw Trent's aristocratic generational wealth parents up in their raised VIP booth, their expressions morphing from polite confusion to mounting horror. Then I looked down at the front row, staring right into the terrified, trembling faces of Reverend Calvin and Vivica Washington. I raised the microphone to my mouth. My voice boomed across the acoustic perfection of the grand ballroom. It was entirely steady, entirely devoid of fear, and cold enough to freeze the room. I said, "Good evening, everyone. Trent has spent the last 45 minutes standing on this stage lecturing all of you about family values, community integrity, and the sacred duty of honest leadership. He has asked for your trust, your votes, and your money based on the pristine, untouched image of his perfect family. I think it is only fair that you get to meet the actual foundation of that family." I took a step back and gently guided Aaliyah to the very front of the stage so everyone in the room could see her clearly under the bright lights. She stood tall in her custom crimson dress, looking like a brilliant, undeniable beacon of truth against the backdrop of their lies. The gasps from the audience were immediate, loud, and collective. The resemblance between Aaliyah myself and the Washington family sitting in the front row was absolutely impossible to deny. The elite socialites in the crowd were incredibly observant, and the visual evidence clicking into place sent a shockwave of scandalous realization rippling through the tables. I raised the microphone again, cutting through the rising tide of murmurs. I said I want to introduce you all to Aaliyah. She is 6 years old. She loves painting butterflies and reading picture books. She is also the biological daughter of the woman hiding right behind this podium. I pointed directly at Kendra. Kendra let out a sharp, breathless sob and shrank back, burying her face in her hands, as a collective wave of disgust washed over the front rows. Trent looked like he was going to vomit, still pinned in place by DeAndre's imposing presence. I kept my voice loud and unwavering, driving the truth into every corner of the room. I said 6 years ago, while I was out of the country, working a corporate audit, Kendra got pregnant. To protect her elite social standing, and to protect her future marriage to this political fraud standing next to her, she hid the pregnancy. When it came time to deliver the baby, Kendra did not take responsibility. She committed a felony. She stole my identity. She forged my signature on state documents, slapped my name on a birth certificate, and abandoned this beautiful little girl to a paid nanny so she could play the role of the perfect, unburdened political wife. The wealthy donors at the front tables began whispering frantically to each other. Trent's parents were sitting completely rigid in their booth, staring down at Kendra with a look of absolute, unfiltered revulsion. I did not let up. I turned the heat up, exposing the deepest layers of their cruelty. I said they treated this child like a dirty secret. They funded her erasure. And when they could no longer afford to pay the nanny to keep her hidden, they abandoned her at a local private academy just a few days ago. They were fully prepared to let her be swallowed by the state foster care system. They were entirely willing to erase a human life just to keep Trent's campaign optics looking clean for all of you tonight. Kendra screamed from behind the podium, her voice shrill and desperate, claiming I was lying. My father, Reverend Calvin, suddenly jumped out of his chair in the front row. His face was purple with rage. He rushed toward the stairs of the stage, shouting at me to put the microphone down and stop bringing shame to the church. I looked down at the man who had threatened me with federal prison just to protect his own fake empire. I did not back down. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile. The personal exposure was complete, but I was a forensic accountant, and it was time to show them the real math. I told my father to stay exactly where he was because I was not just here to talk about his daughter's felonies. I was here to talk about his ledgers. Kendra grips the polished edges of the podium, her knuckles turning bone white. She screams into the live microphone that I am a jealous liar, her voice cracking and echoing through the massive ballroom speakers. She sounds desperate, frantic, and entirely unhinged. The pearl-colored gown she wears suddenly looks like a cheap costume as she tries to hide her face from the glaring stage lights. Down in the front row, my father abandons his seat. His face is a mask of pure purple rage. Reverend Calvin Washington marches toward the stage steps, his heavy footsteps thudding against the carpet. He points a thick finger at me, using his booming pastoral voice, commanding me to put the microphone down and stop bringing shame to the church. He turns to the crowd, raising his hands, declaring that his eldest daughter is having a severe mental breakdown and needs immediate psychiatric help. I do not back down. I look down at my father and tell him to stay exactly where he is. I reach into the pocket of my tailored crimson blazer and pull out my smartphone. Thanks to the absolute authority I secured over the hotel tonight, the audiovisual team up in the balcony is taking direct orders from me alone. I give a sharp upward nod toward the back of the room. Instantly, the massive high-definition presentation monitors hanging behind the stage blink to black. Trent's pristine patriotic campaign logos completely vanish. In their place, my phone screen mirrors onto the massive displays for the entire city elite to see. First, I pull up the birth certificate. The document towers over the stage 20 feet high and impossible to ignore. I point to the signature at the very bottom. I tell the quiet, breathless room to look closely at the handwriting. Then, with a single swipe of my finger, a second document appears right next to it. It is a highly magnified image of Kendra's signature pulled directly from the gala's own registration forms. The sweeping capital letters and the distinct rightward slant are flawlessly identical. I speak into the microphone, letting my voice carry clinical, undeniable authority. I tell the audience that I am a senior forensic accountant, and identifying corporate fraud is what I do for a living. I break down the pen strokes live on screen, tracing the exact pressure points and loops that prove without a shadow of a doubt that the golden child of the Washington family committed felony identity theft. I tell them Kendra stole my social security number to hide a pregnancy that would have ruined her pristine marriage prospects, and then she abandoned her own daughter to protect her country club lifestyle. Calvin reaches the edge of the stage, screaming at the security guards lining the walls to cut the power to the screens. The massive guards stand completely still, their arms folded, obeying my earlier executive directive. Calvin realizes he cannot silence the monitors, so he tries to silence the crowd. He turns around, his chest heaving, telling the mayor and the wealthy political donors that these are fabricated documents created by a bitter, estranged daughter trying to extort her family. I look at my father and tell him that since he wants to talk about fabrication, we should talk about his church building fund. I swipe my phone screen again. The birth certificate disappears, instantly replaced by the internal financial ledgers of his prestigious megachurch. A collective horrifying gasp ripples through the tables where his most prominent board members and deacons are sitting. I highlight a series of massive cash transfers spanning the last 8 months. They are labeled as administrative consulting fees and construction retainers. I tell the audience that these payments were sent to phantom companies registered to empty post office boxes hundreds of miles out of state. I zoom in on the bottom of every single authorization form. Projected 20 feet high for his entire congregation to witness is the undeniable verified signature of Reverend Calvin Washington. I do not let them breathe. I trace the money flow live on the screens, moving with the terrifying speed of a seasoned auditor. I show the funds leaving the sacred church accounts, bouncing through blind holding companies registered in Delaware and routing directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Then I bring up Trent's supposedly self-funded city council campaign finance records right beside the offshore routing numbers. I highlight a massive recent influx of capital deposited just weeks before his campaign officially launched. I tell the room to look at the numbers. The deposits match perfectly down to the very last cent. $250,000. I turn to Trent, who is still pinned against the podium by DeAndre. DeAndre's massive hand rests firmly on Trent's chest, preventing the desperate politician from moving an inch. I speak directly to Trent, but my voice fills the entire ballroom. I tell the audience that Trent loves to brag about his generational wealth and his incorruptible self-funded campaign. I tell them they have been listening to a man who is entirely hollow. I swipe to the final set of documents. I project Trent's actual heavily encrypted asset sheets. I break down his fake wealth for the room. I expose his underwater commercial properties, his maxed-out credit lines, and the toxic debt crushing his entire estate. I tell the major donors sitting in the front rows that Trent is completely broke. I tell them he is drowning in leverage to private creditors. I point to the massive number highlighted in red on the screens. I tell the horrified crowd that the only way Trent could afford this glittering $1,000-a-plate gala tonight was by stealing $250,000 from hard-working families who trusted their pastor to build a community center. I tell the donors that the man asking for their political backing and their campaign checks is nothing but a heavily indebted fraud using stolen church offerings to buy a seat on the city council. The silence in the grand ballroom shatters like a massive pane of glass crashing onto the marble floor. The sheer magnitude of the financial ruin projected on those massive screens finally registers with the city elite. A woman in the second row actually drops her champagne flute. The crystal shatters against the floor, and that single sharp sound acts as a starting pistol for absolute unfiltered chaos. Hundreds of the wealthiest, most influential power brokers in the state simultaneously realize they have tied their names, their reputations, and their corporate checkbooks to a massive federal embezzlement scheme. The panic is instantaneous. Chairs scrape violently against the floorboards as dozens of men in custom tuxedos jump to their feet. They are frantically pulling out their cell phones, barking desperate orders to their private attorneys and public relations managers. They know that when the federal government audits a fraudulent political campaign, everyone who donated gets dragged into the financial blast radius. They are scrambling to distance themselves from Trent before the ink on their campaign checks even dries. I look toward the center of the room. The mayor is already moving. He does not offer a word of support to my parents or to Kendra. He signals his security detail and marches straight toward the side exit, his face an unreadable mask of political survival. He is cutting his losses and abandoning ship immediately. Up in the raised VIP booth, Trent's aristocratic parents are completely frozen. They belong to a world of generational wealth where public scandal is the ultimate unforgivable sin. They look down at their son standing on the stage. There is no maternal sympathy or paternal instinct to protect him. Their faces twist with pure aristocratic disgust. His father slowly shakes his head, turns his back on the stage, and leads his wife out of the booth. They are leaving him to the wolves. Trent watches his entire empire vaporize in less than 60 seconds. He watches his wealthy backers sprint for the doors. He watches his own parents walk away. The polished, charismatic veneer completely melts off his face, revealing the desperate cornered fraud underneath. His chest heaves, his perfectly styled hair, now a disheveled mess sticking to his sweating forehead. He locks eyes with me, and something in his mind simply snaps. He loses every last ounce of his political restraint. Trent lets out a visceral, animalistic scream. He breaks free from the podium and lunges directly at me. He swings his arms wildly, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, screaming that I ruined his life, that I destroyed his family, that he is going to kill me. I do not flinch. I do not take a single step backward. I keep Aaliyah securely tucked behind my leg, shielding her from his violence, my posture completely rigid and unbothered. I know I do not have to move. DeAndre is faster. My fraternity brother steps effortlessly into Trent's path, grabbing the desperate politician by the lapels of his expensive suit and shoving him violently back against the wooden podium. But DeAndre does not have to throw a punch because the main double doors of the ballroom burst open with a terrifying synchronized crash. A tactical unit of police officers floods into the grand ballroom. Their heavy boots thunder against the polished wood as they storm straight down the center aisle. DeAndre had made the call over an hour ago. He had handed over the ironclad digital evidence of the church embezzlement directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the police department just as we were getting dressed for the gala. The authorities had been waiting in the hotel lobby, monitoring the situation, waiting for my signal. The lead detective marches up the stage steps, flashing a gold badge. He does not care about Trent's political connections or his wealthy family name. He grabs Trent by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him chest first against the political banners bearing his own campaign slogan. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy steel handcuffs echoes across the stage. The detective reads Trent his rights with a loud, booming voice that completely overtakes the chaotic noise of the fleeing donors. He formally places Trent under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and severe campaign finance violations. Trent struggles against the metal cuffs, weeping openly, begging the officers to let him go, screaming that it is all a misunderstanding. The officers ignore his pathetic protests, completely unmoved by the tears of a broken con artist. Down in the front row, Kendra collapses into her chair, sobbing hysterically, completely paralyzed by the destruction of her pristine, wealthy lifestyle. My father, Reverend Calvin, stands entirely frozen. The arrogant, untouchable church leader who had threatened me with federal prison just yesterday is now watching his hand-picked golden son-in-law get hauled away like a common thief. Calvin realizes that his signature is on every single one of those fraudulent transfer documents currently projected on the massive screens above him. He realizes the police will be coming for him next. The utter devastation on his face is absolute perfection. Two officers flank Trent, grabbing him by the biceps and physically drag him off the stage. They march him right down the center aisle, parading the humiliated, weeping politician through the remnants of his own high society gala. Cell phone cameras flash from the remaining guests, immortalizing his downfall. I stand at the center of the stage, breathing in the sweet air of total victory. The financial and social execution is complete. I have ripped the mask off the monsters who tried to destroy me. Trent's pathetic wails echo down the grand hallway until the heavy brass doors slam shut, cutting him off completely. The ballroom feels like the epicenter of a freshly detonated bomb. The silence is incredibly heavy, broken only by the frantic murmurs of the few guests who have not bolted for the exits. Down in the front row, the flawless facade of Vivica Washington violently shatters. She collapses onto the carpeted floor. Her emerald silk gown pools around her as she drops to her knees, weeping hysterically. She is not crying for the daughter she abandoned or the granddaughter she tried to erase. She is crying for her social death. She wails about the scandal. She screams that the bank is going to take the Heritage Hills estate, that their elite creditors will see the news on the morning broadcast and seize everything they own. She cries that they are going to be homeless and ruined in front of the entire country club. I walk slowly down the stage steps. The sharp click of my heels cuts right through her sobbing. The remaining audience members hold their collective breath as I approach the woman who birthed me. Calvin stands paralyzed beside her, a hollowed-out shell of a mega-church pastor, realizing he is about to trade his tailored custom suits for a federal prison jumpsuit. I stop right in front of Vivica. I slowly lower myself, kneeling down, until I am perfectly eye-level with her tear-streaked, panicked face. I look at the absolute terror in her eyes. I reach into the inner pocket of my crimson blazer. I pull out the heavy certified commercial property deed. I tell her to stop crying about the bank. I speak softly, but the acoustics of the silent ballroom carry my voice to every corner. I say you will not lose the Heritage Hills estate to the bank, Mom. You lost it to me. I bought your distressed debt entirely in cash yesterday morning. I own the paper on your mansion. I am your landlord. Vivica stops crying. The breath physically leaves her lungs. She stares at the property deed in my hand, her eyes tracing the legal seals and my corporate signature. The realization hits her like a physical blow. The daughter she wrote off as a boring, invisible number cruncher now literally owns the roof over her head. I stand back up, towering over her. I deliver the final crushing strike. I tell her she has exactly 30 days to pack up her designer clothes and vacate my property before I have the county sheriff physically remove her and Calvin from the premises. I tell her she is officially evicted from her own kingdom. I turn my gaze to Kendra, who is still huddled behind the podium on the stage, completely broken and staring blankly into space. I project my voice so she hears every single word. I tell her the permanent custody surrender she signed earlier today is already filed with the family court. She has absolutely zero legal rights to Aaliyah, and her criminal fraud complaint is sitting on the district attorney's desk, waiting to be activated the second she tries to contact us or launch a public relations spin. I look at Calvin, whose pastoral arrogance has been completely obliterated. I tell him to enjoy the upcoming federal audit of his church accounts. I remind him that the Internal Revenue Service does not forgive wire fraud, and God certainly does not forgive a pastor who steals from the working-class families of his own congregation just to buy a seat at a country club. The annihilation is absolute. I have systematically dismantled their finances, their freedom, and their social standing. I have legally, morally, and financially stripped them down to nothing. I walk over to DeAndre, who gives me a firm, deeply respectful nod. He has secured the perimeter, ensuring our exit path is completely unobstructed. I walk back to the front row where Camille is standing with Aaliyah. Aaliyah is clutching her teddy bear, but she is standing incredibly tall in her custom crimson dress. She looks at the broken, weeping people who tried to throw her away like garbage. There is no fear in her dark eyes anymore. The monsters under her bed have been dragged into the glaring light and completely destroyed. I kneel down and take Aaliyah's small, warm hand in mine. I ask her if she is ready to go home. She looks up at me and a bright, genuine smile spreads across her face. It is the smile of a child who finally knows she is safe, protected, and unconditionally loved. She squeezes my fingers tight and says yes. I stand up, keeping her hands securely in mine. We turn our backs on the wreckage of the Washington family empire. We walk together up the center aisle, moving with grace, power, and absolute freedom. The heavy brass doors of the Grand Magnolia Hotel open for us one last time. We step out into the crisp, cool night air of the city. I did not just survive the toxic, status-obsessed family that tried to bury me. I burned their kingdom to the ground. And from those ashes, Aaliyah and I are walking away to build a real family of our own.